viewers, it's my Lemonade IS Academy and today we are going to see inflation. So inflation is nothing but the persistent rise in price level. If the price of the commodity is constantly increasing, then it is called as inflation. So during inflation period, the cost of a cup of coffee may cost around 1000 rupees or 10,000 rupees, and the cost of a chocolate may cost you around 1000, 10,000, 1 lakh. So the cost of the commodities, all the commodities will be increased during inflation, and during inflation, the value of the money will be decreased. What does it mean? If the value of the money is decreased, means using 1 rupee, if you can buy a chocolate today, then tomorrow with that 1 rupee you can't do anything. You need 1000 rupees to buy a chocolate, which means that 999 rupees has lost its value today. Okay, today you can buy a chocolate using 1 rupee, but tomorrow if it cost 1000 rupees, then 999 rupees does not cost any value, right? This situation is called as inflation, in which money loses its value. Money loses its value and the commodities price will be increased. This situation is called as inflation generally. So during inflation, money supply will be increased. First major thing which you should remember is during inflation, money supply will be increased. If there is more money supply in market, then it will cause inflation. Example, if the liquidity in the market is increased, then money supply will increase in the market, which will lead to inflation. And during inflation, the cost of the commodities will increase. The price of the commodities will increase and the money will lose its value. These are the features in inflation. So during inflation, the purchasing power of the people will be reduced. Why? Because during inflation period, the people can't purchase a chocolate for 1000 rupees, right? During that period, what they are forced to do is they will reduce their consumption. So during inflation period, the purchasing power of the people will be reduced, and because of that, their consumption will be reduced during inflation. But during inflation, generally, employment will be high. The unemployment rate will be low during inflation, and it is expressed in Phillips curve. We will be seeing those things later. First, we should know what is inflation. It is the persistent rise in price level. The price of the commodities will be constantly increased and the value of the money will be decreased, and the money supply in the market will be high, and because of the high money supply in the market only, value of the money will be decreased, and because of this, purchasing power of the people will be reduced. So people are forced to reduce their consumption. So if a family is buying 1 liter of milk today, during inflation period they will be procuring half kg. Why? Because they won't have enough money. They can't pay the amount, because today it may cost around 80 rupees and tomorrow during inflation period it will be costing around 8000 rupees. Because of this, purchasing power of the people will be reduced. These are the basic things which are relating to inflation. And relating inflation, we have many terms. We have inflation, deflation, disinflation, reflation, and we have headline inflation, core inflation, walking inflation, creeping inflation, galloping inflation. Let us see those things one by one. First, this is the curve. Generally, we see this curve for economic slowdown, recession, and for economy. But this is for inflation. During inflation period, the price of the commodities will be increased, right? So up to this, it is inflation. The price of the commodities has increased during inflation, and during disinflation, means inflation is coming down. Inflation is coming down, but not in negative territory. It is coming down. Then it is called as disinflation. Here, the inflation has came down and it is in negative territory. And this is called as deflation. Deflation is exactly opposite to that of inflation, and during deflation period, the price of the commodities, the price of the goods will be reduced. So decrease in the price of the goods is called as deflation, and it is opposite to that of inflation. And during inflation period, the producer will be getting benefited and the consumers will be getting affected, because consumers can't pay the money for commodities, right? So consumers are the one who is getting affected during inflation, but during deflation period, consumers will be benefited because of the fall in prices, but the producers will be getting affected because they need to give the goods for a very low price, right? So producers will be affected during deflation, whereas producers will be benefited during inflation. And then after deflation, we have reflation. During deflation period, what government do is government try to increase the cost of the prices, and bring it to normal level. So government will try to bring the cost of the prices high. That is called as reflation, where price level will go down in negative and the government try to increase the price level. That is called as reflation. This is the curve. So first is inflation, where price of the commodities getting increased, and then disinflation, price of the commodities getting down but not in negative territory, where deflation is opposite to that of inflation, price of the goods is in negative territory. The decrease in price of the goods is called as deflation. During deflation period, consumer got benefited because of the fall in prices, whereas producer gets affected because of the fall in prices, whereas during inflation period, producer gets benefited due to increase in prices, whereas consumer gets affected due to increase in prices. Whereas reflation, government tried to increase the price level and bring it to normal level. This is called as reflation. These are the 4 things which you should know relating to inflation. Apart from these 4, we have stagflation. Stagflation is nothing but inflation combined with unemployment. Generally during inflation we have high employment, but if there is unemployment during inflation, then it is called as stagflation. Inflation plus unemployment is called as stagflation. There are 2 reasons for inflation. One is demand pull inflation and another one is cost push inflation. Let us see the reasons for inflation. Reasons. There are 2 reasons for inflation. One is demand pull, another one is cost push. First one is demand pull. If there is a mismatch between the demand and the supply, then it is called as demand pull inflation. That will lead to demand pull inflation. First one is population. If the number of people is getting increased, if the population is increasing, then demand will increase. Let us take food commodities. So if population increases, more people are in need of food, then the demand for the food commodities will increase. So if there is an increase in demand and if the supply is same, the supply has not changed, the supply is same means, then what it will lead to means, it will lead to inflation. There is an increase in demand, but there is a supply side is same. This will lead to inflation. So because of the rise in population, inflation can come because of the mismatch between the demand and the supply. Second, government increases expenditure. If government increases the expenditure, it will also lead to inflation. However, if government increases the expenditure, say government has many schemes and it is introducing many infrastructure development programs, it is building roads and dams, then what it will do is, because of all these things, people will get more employment. Because of the high employment, money supply in the market will be increased. Because of the high money supply in the market, this will lead to inflation, because if there is more money supply in the market, the value of money will be reduced. If the value of the money will be reduced, then the price of the commodities will be increased, right? If government increases expenditure, more people will be getting employment. Because of the high employment, many people, the money supply in the market will be increased. Because of the high money supply in the market, this can lead to inflation. This is the second reason for inflation. And then example for this, we can say 7th 5-year commission. During 7th 5-year commission, the salaries, the government staff salaries are increased. Because of the hike in salary, the money supply in the market is increased, and because of this, inflation happened during that period. And the third one is black money. If there is a black money in market, say there is some black money, there is more black money in the market, means the people who are having black money have more purchasing power. Because of their high purchasing power, the cost of the products may be increased. Because of the increase in cost of the products, black money holders can purchase the products for that price, but the other persons who are not having black money will be getting affected. So the purchasing power of the black money holders will be high, and because of their high purchasing power, the cost of the products may be increased. Because of the increase in the cost of the products, it may lead to inflation, which will affect other people. Fourth, if money supply in the market is high, if RBI has printed more money, if more money is printed, then money supply in the market will be high. Because of the high money supply in the market, inflation can happen. This is the fourth point. These are the things these are the reasons for demand pull inflation. And other than demand pull inflation, these are the reasons. Two reasons. One is demand pull inflation. Under demand pull inflation only we have population. So because of the population, increase in population, there is a mismatch between the demand and supply. If there is an increase in population, then the demand for the products, food products and other products will be increased, but the supply side is same. Because of this mismatch, inflation can happen. If the government has increased the expenditure, the employment of the people will be increased. Because of the high employment, more money supply will be in market. If there is more money supply in market, then inflation can happen. Then third one is black money. Because of the black money holders will have high purchasing power. Because of their high purchasing power, the cost of the products may increase, which will lead to inflation. And fourth one is, if more money is printed, there will be more money supply in the market, which can lead to inflation. And these are the demand pull inflation. These are the things which come under demand pull inflation. And another one is we have cost push inflation. In cost push inflation, if the raw material cost is increased, that may lead to inflation. Example, let us take rubber. If the cost of the rubber is increased, then the product price will be increased. Rubber is the raw material to produce a tire. So if the cost of the rubber is increased, then the cost of the tire will also be increased. If the cost of the tire is increased, if same thing happens for all the commodities, say the cost of the rubber is increased, the cost of crude oil is increased, the cost of petroleum products is increased, then cost of rice, wheat, the cost of cotton, if everything is increased, then because of the increase in the cost of the raw materials, the cost of the products will also be increased. Because of this increase, it will lead to inflation. So example, let us take crude oil. So if the crude oil price has increased, what happens is, then petrol price will be increased. If the price of the petrol is increased, then the cost of all the commodities will be affected. Why? Because this petrol is the thing which we use for transportation. Because of this, any commodities, say agricultural products like rice, wheat and vegetables, fruits, all these commodities we generally transport from one place to another. If the cost of the petrol is increased, then there will be high transportation cost. Because of the high transportation cost, the cost of every commodities will be affected. So the crude oil, if there is an increase in price of the crude oil, it will affect the price of all the commodities, which can lead to inflation. This is cost push inflation. Then these are the reasons for inflation. One is demand pull, then is cost push. Then we have effect of inflation. Already we have seen what are the effects of inflation. Generally, it erodes the purchasing power of the people. People will not have enough purchasing power, which means that people can't purchase the commodities for such a high price. Say if the cost of the milk packet is around 20 rupees. So 20 rupees, if the cost of the milk packet is 20 rupees today, if the cost of the milk packet during inflation period is around 2000 rupees, then more people will not have enough money to purchase this milk packet. Then what they will do is, they will reduce their consumption. So it eroded their purchasing power, first point. Then two is, it will force the consumers to reduce their consumption, second point. And third one is, it will increase the gap between the rich and the poor. Because rich people will have the ability to purchase. Even if it is for 2000, they can purchase. But poor, they can't afford 2000 rupees for a milk packet, right? So because of this, the gap between the rich and the poor will increase. And fourth one is, it can increase, it can reduce the unemployment, but there are certain scenarios in which it can cause unemployment. Example, stagflation. During stagflation, there will be inflation as well as there will be unemployment. And during inflation period, the one who gets benefited is borrower. Borrower will be getting benefited. Why? Because if someone has borrowed 1000 rupees today, using this 1000 rupees they can make so many things today. But during inflation period, what they can do is they can buy a cup of coffee using this 1000 rupees. So during inflation period, they can easily repay this 1000 rupees. But the lender is the one who is going to get affected. How? Because during inflation period, the lender using this 1000 rupees, they can't do anything. But the borrower will repay it. So the borrower is the one who is getting benefited during inflation, and the lender is the one who is going to get affected by inflation. So the largest lender is generally bank. Bank is the one who is the largest lender. The bank is the one who lend for all the people, right? So banks are the one who is going to get affected during this inflation period. Because of this, the whole economy will be affected. If the bank is affected, the whole economy will be affected. So, and other persons who are benefited by inflation is the producer will be benefited by inflation, whereas the consumer will be affected by inflation. And other persons like bond holders. Bond holders will face loss, whereas equity holders will be gainers. And there is another one bond called as, in relating inflation itself, there is a bond, inflation indexed bonds. This inflation indexed bonds, the interest rate will vary according to the inflation. It is called as inflation indexed bonds. So the bond holders are the losses and the equity holders are gainers. These things are already asked in UPSC civil service question. And the losses, the bond holders, debentures, savers, everyone are losses, whereas the equity holders will be gaining. Why? Because considering equity, they will give us share in profit, right? During inflation period, all the companies will be earning so much of profit because they are producers. Producers are in safer side. Producers are the one who are gainers, right? Because during inflation period, producers are the one who are gainers. So because of this, companies will be seeing enormous profit, and because of this, the equity holders will also be gainers, whereas the bond holders and the money savers and debentures are the one who are losses. So this is already asked in UPSC civil service question, so it is important. And what is inflationary gap? Inflationary gap is nothing but if the government expenditure is more. If the government expenditure is more compared to income, then it is called as inflationary gap. Generally, this is what we are facing now. The expenditure side, the government's expenditure is high compared to its income. Whereas deflationary gap is if government's expenditure is low. If there is a shortfall in government spending, then it is called as deflationary gap. So these are the terms which are relating to inflation. And then there are two ways of inflation. We can say one is headline inflation and another one is core inflation. So in headline inflation, the food and energy inflation is also included in headline inflation, whereas in core inflation, the food and energy inflation is not added. Why? Because this food and energy is more volatile. It is highly volatile. Because of this, the food and energy inflation is excluded in core inflation. So generally in headline inflation, let us say the cost of onions during before 2 years, I guess, there is an increase in onion price. Because of this, there is a food inflation. During that period, if we calculated the headline inflation, the inflation will be high. Headline inflation will be high in India. But core inflation will be usual. Why? Because the hike in onion prices will lead to a hike in headline inflation. So headline inflation is the one in which the inflation is calculated by adding the food inflation as well as energy inflation, whereas in core inflation, the inflation is calculated by excluding the food inflation and energy inflation. Why? Because this food and energy is more volatile. You can see the cost of the vegetables will highly change. From day to day, you can see the change in prices. So the food and energy is the one which is more volatile. Because of this, they are excluded while calculating the core inflation. Generally, if we say inflation, it is headline inflation. Generally, if term inflation is used in newspapers or anything, they mean headline inflation. And there are two ways to measure inflation. One is CPI, another one is WPI. From CPI and WPI, last year question is asked. One is CPI, another one is WPI. CPI means Consumer Price Index, whereas WPI means Wholesale Price Index. First, let us see Wholesale Price Index. In Wholesale Price Index, 697 products or goods are taken in a basket, and the one who calculates this WPI is Office of Economic Advisor. Office of Economic Advisor is the one who calculates Wholesale Price Index, and while calculating Wholesale Price Index, 697 products are taken in basket, and in Wholesale Price Index, services are not included. This is an important point. Goods are the only thing which is taken in Wholesale Price Index, and services are not included in Wholesale Price Index, and 697 products are taken, and the one who calculates Wholesale Price Index is Office of Economic Advisor. These are the important things. And Wholesale Price Index is mentioned if news which contains inflation. If it means inflation, generally it means Consumer Price Index inflation, because we use Consumer Price Index for calculating inflation. Let us go to CPI. So in CPI, Consumer Price Index, they use both goods and services to calculate the Consumer Price Index. So here services are not included, whereas in Consumer Price Index both goods and services are included, and CPI can be divided into three. One is CPI for industrial workers, 2 CPI for agricultural and rural level, and 3 is CPI for rural and urban combined. CPI for industrial workers, CPI for agriculture and rural level, and agriculture or rural level, and CPI for rural and urban combined. These are the three divisions in CPI. CPI can be divided into three: CPI IW, CPI for industrial workers, CPI for agriculture or rural, and CPI for rural and urban combined. CPI for industrial workers is calculated by Labour Bureau. So Labour Bureau is the one who calculates CPI for industrial workers, and CPI for agriculture or rural and CPI for rural and urban, both is calculated by the Central Statistical Office, and all these three will be combined. So all these three will be combined by Central Statistical Office. CSO is the one who combines and releases this CPI. So CPI is combined and released by Central Statistical Office, whereas for WPI it is Office of Economic Advisor. And for calculating CPI, the base year is 2016. 2016 is the base year for calculating CPI. For WPI, the base year is 2011. And in CPI, we include both goods as well as services. Because of all these benefits, we use CPI to calculate inflation. So RBI currently use CPI to calculate the inflation, because using CPI, we can do precise calculation for inflation. So we use CPI. And relating CPI, we say a good is produced, say farming. Rice is produced, and this rice is stored in mandis, and it is distributed to wholesale dealers, and then finally it is distributed to consumers, right? So if we take the consumer side, then it is Consumer Price Index. If we take the wholesale side, the wholesale, then it is Wholesale Price Index. So Wholesale Price Index is focusing on producer level, whereas Consumer Price Index focuses on the consumer level. So this is the difference between Wholesale Price Index and Consumer Price Index. Relating Wholesale Price Index and Consumer Price Index, there is a question last year. So Wholesale Price Index and Consumer Price Index is news. And we have types of inflation. Based on the percentage of increase in inflation, there are types of inflation. First one is walking inflation, then walking inflation is also called as creeping inflation. Then you have galloping inflation and hyperinflation. First, walking inflation. In walking inflation, the inflation will be in single digits. Say inflation 6%, inflation 7%, 8%. Then it is called as creeping inflation or walking inflation. And the second one is we have galloping inflation, because galloping inflation is very high. The inflation is in double or triple digit, and that is called as galloping inflation. It is around 20%, 30%. Double or triple digit, then it is called as galloping inflation. And we have hyperinflation. Hyperinflation means inflation shoot up overnight. If the inflation shoot up, and then it is called as hyperinflation. During hyperinflation, inflation is in million level, trillion level. That is called as hyperinflation. So these are the inflation based on the percentage of inflation. First is creeping inflation or walking inflation, second galloping inflation, and third one is hyperinflation. In hyperinflation, inflation will shoot up overnight in million or trillion level. Then apart from this, we have measures to control inflation. To control inflation, we have many measures, and those are very important for UPSC civil service exam. You can constantly see questions from ways to control inflation. Measures to control inflation. So first you should know who is the one who is going to control inflation, and you should know who is the one responsible for this inflation. The person who is going to control this inflation is RBI. RBI is the one who controls inflation, and the person who is responsible for this inflation is Government of India. Government of India is the one who is responsible for inflation. Earlier we have seen a point during demand pull inflation, in which I have said that if the government increase their expenditure, then inflation increases. So Government of India, what they generally do is they will increase their expenditure, they will increase their spending, they will increase their infrastructure plans, they will give more schemes and more incentives. Because of this, more money supply will be there in the market. Because of their high money supply in the market, inflation will be increased. So Government of India is the one who is responsible for inflation, who is the one causing inflation, whereas RBI is the one who is going to control the inflation. So relating control measures of inflation, so RBI is the one who is doing that. First, we have two measures to control inflation. One is quantitative method and another one is qualitative method. These are the two methods to control inflation. In quantitative method, we have many things. So quantitative measure is more important compared to that of qualitative measure. First let us see quantitative measures, in which we have bank rate. Bank rate is the RBI is going to give money to the scheduled commercial banks. There are certain banks which are kept under the Schedule 2 of the RBI Act 1934, and those banks are called as scheduled commercial banks. So those banks are eligible to get money from RBI. So if a bank is going to get some money from RBI, they are going to get it at certain percentage of interest rate. They need to pay some interest rate to the RBI to get money from RBI. They need to borrow money from RBI. So they give some percentage of money, interest rate, and that is called as bank rate. If they are going to get long term loan, then it is called as bank rate. If it is for a short term, then it is called as repo rate. And if they are going to get it overnight without any collateral or security, then it is called as marginal standing facility. And there are other things which are relating to quantitative measures to control inflation. We have cash reserve ratio, statutory liquid ratio, and we also have reverse repo rate. Let us see these things. Okay, first let us see cash reserve ratio. It is very important. The thing between these six, the most important one is cash reserve ratio and repo rate are the most important thing. So first let us see cash reserve ratio. So first, there are certain banks which are kept under scheduled commercial, which are kept under Schedule 2 of the RBI Act 1934, which are called as scheduled commercial banks, and these banks are eligible to get loan from RBI. So foreign banks will not exist under this. Foreign banks will not exist under this scheduled commercial banks. These scheduled banks need to keep some deposit with the RBI. They need to keep some deposit with the RBI, and that deposit is called as cash reserve ratio. Say if a bank is having 1000 rupees, from this 1000 rupees, they need to keep around 4%, which means 40 rupees. They need to keep 40 rupees with the RBI. It is called as cash reserve ratio. So scheduled bank need to keep some deposit with the RBI, and for this deposit, for this 40 rupees, RBI won't pay any interest for this scheduled commercial banks. So if a scheduled commercial bank is having 1000 rupees, in this 1000 rupees, they need to keep 40 rupees with the RBI, but RBI won't pay interest rate for this cash reserve ratio. That is called as cash reserve ratio. Then second one is statutory liquid ratio. The same thing. If a bank is having 1000 rupees, they need to keep a certain percentage, say 15%. It need to keep with the it need to keep aside. It does not need to keep it with the RBI. It has to maintain it by itself. It has to keep it aside. It should not be spent, and that is called as statutory liquid ratio. So this scheduled commercial banks need to keep this statutory liquid ratio maybe around 15% with itself as a money in a easily convertible format. If I say easily convertible format, it can be rupee cash, or it can be gold, or it can be certain approved government securities. In SLR we have G-Sec, government securities, cash, gold. So if a bank is having 1000 rupees, certain percentage it should be deposited with RBI. It should be kept with RBI, which should not be spent, and RBI won't give interest rate. That is called as cash reserve ratio. Whereas statutory liquid ratio, the same thing. Certain percentage should be kept unspent, but it should be kept with itself. The bank should keep it with itself, but it should not be spent, and it should be in easily convertible format, and that is called as statutory liquid ratio, in which we can keep cash money, and we can give gold or some approved government securities. These are the things which come under statutory liquid ratio. And apart from this, we have bank rate. Bank rate, I have already said, right, if scheduled commercial banks need to get loan from RBI, if the loan is long-term loan, the interest rate which RBI says is called as bank rate. If it is a short-term loan, then it is called as repo rate. If RBI borrows from the scheduled commercial banks, in repo rate, what I said is scheduled commercial banks is going to borrow from RBI, whereas in reverse repo rate, if RBI is going to borrow from scheduled commercial banks, then scheduled commercial banks can get certain percentage as the interest rate from RBI. But this reverse repo rate is also fixed by RBI. Repo rate is also fixed by RBI. So this repo rate, reverse repo rate, bank rate, marginal standing facility, everything is fixed by RBI. In marginal standing facility, if scheduled commercial banks need money, it can get it overnight from RBI without any collateral or security. Then the interest rate for that is called as marginal standing facility. So using these things, we can control inflation. Let us see how. Simple thing which you can remember is, by increasing all these things, we can control inflation. By increasing all these things, we can control inflation. By increasing the bank rate, repo rate, reverse repo rate, marginal standing facility, cash reserve ratio, statutory liquid ratio, by increasing all these six, we can control the inflation. Let us see how. First, if bank rate is increased, what happens is, then if RBI gives loan for 5% to scheduled commercial banks, then what scheduled commercial bank do is, they will give loan to us for 8% and they will gain this 3% as the profit. So what we do is, we will get money from the scheduled commercial banks. But if bank rate is increased by the RBI, what happens is, if bank rate is 8%, then what scheduled commercial bank do is, they will increase our interest rate. Then our interest rate might be hiked to 12%. Then what we do is, we won't borrow money. Why? Because of this high interest rate, we can't repay the loan. So that we will reduce our borrowing, right? Because of this, money supply in the market will be reduced. This is the case common for bank rate, repo rate and marginal standing facility. In bank rate also, if bank rate is increased, what bank do is, they will increase our interest rate. Because of this, we will hesitate to borrow. Because of this, money supply in the market will be reduced. For bank rate, repo rate and marginal standing facility, same story. Whereas for the other three, what happens is, for repo rate, what happens is, if reverse repo rate is increased, what happens is, if generally bank give loan for 8% to people. So bank give 8%, at 8% interest rate, it give loan to people. If reverse repo rate is to 12%, what bank do is, instead of giving money to people, it will give it back to RBI, because RBI is going to pay 12%. So scheduled commercial bank is going to focus on profit, and the more profit is on giving money to RBI, right? Because of this, bank will give money to RBI itself. So because of this, money flow in the market is going to get reduced because of increase in reverse repo rate. And by increasing cash reserve ratio and statutory liquid ratio, say earlier I have said 1000 rupees, in which 40 rupees should be kept with kept as cash reserve ratio 4%. If it is increased, means if the cash reserve ratio is increased to 8%, then 80 rupees should be kept with RBI, which means that here only 960 rupees can be given as loan to the people. Here only 920 rupees can be given as loan to people. So the amount which can be given to people is reduced, right? Because of this, money supply in the market is reduced. So these are the measures to control inflation. And in qualitative measures, generally, what is qualitative measure means? By increasing the formalities, they will ask more documents to get a loan, and they will be asking more documents, verifications, and they will increase, change the limit. Say, if you are going to construct a housing loan, generally if bank is going to give 50% as the loan, then during this period they will give only 20% as the loan. So they will change some limits, and they will increase the formalities. They will increase more formalities, and they will ask more papers in qualitative measure to control the money supply in the market. These are the measures to control inflation, and these are the things which are relating to inflation. So that is all for today. Subscribe to My Lemonade IAS Academy. Thank you.